At 7:15 on the morning of September 19, 1944, Captain Richard Lamerson crouched in the turret of his M4 Sherman tank near the French village of Lizy, watching fog roll across the farmland and listening to something that did not belong there. The sound was unmistakable. Tank engines, German tank engines. And they were close. Lamerson commanded Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armoured Division. His Shermans were positioned along a ridge overlooking the road from Bézange-la-Petite, dug into hull-down positions that exposed only their turrets above the crest. Somewhere in that fog, German Panthers were advancing toward them. Lamerson could hear them but could not see them. The fog was so thick that visibility had dropped to less than 100 meters. Panthers were superior to Shermans in almost every measurable way. The Panther's glacis plate measured 80 millimeters thick and was sloped at 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of nearly 140 millimeters against incoming shells. The Sherman's frontal armor was 51 millimeters, sloped at 56 degrees. A Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman from over 2,000 meters away. The Sherman's standard 75mm gun could not penetrate a Panther's front armor at any range. Not at 2,000 meters, not at 1,000 meters, not at 500 meters, not even at point-blank range. The men in Lamerson's company knew these numbers. Every American tanker in France knew them. The Panther was Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34, a 45-ton Predator designed specifically to destroy enemy armor. The Sherman weighed 33 tons and had been designed to support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and race through gaps in enemy lines. It was never intended to fight other tanks. That job belonged to the tank destroyer battalions with their specialized anti-armor weapons. On paper, this engagement should have been a slaughter. What neither Lamerson nor the German commanders advancing through that fog understood was that the next 11 days would become one of the most decisive American armored victories of the entire war. 200 German tanks and assault guns would be destroyed or disabled. American losses would be 48 tanks. The kill ratio would be better than 4-1 in favor of the Americans, and none of it would happen because of superior equipment. It would happen because farm boys from Iowa, and factory workers from New Jersey, and school teachers from Illinois had learned something the Germans had forgotten. In tank warfare, the crew matters more than the machine, training matters more than technology, and teamwork matters more than tonnage. What happened near that small French village called Arracourt would prove that doctrine and leadership could overcome technological disadvantage. It would become required study at American military academies for decades, and it would demonstrate that the men who maintained, crewed, and commanded those supposedly inferior Sherman tanks were anything but inferior themselves. The 4th Armored Division had been racing across France since late July of 1944. After breaking out from the Normandy beachhead during Operation Cobra, the division had become the spearhead of General George Patton's Third Army. They moved so fast that German units often found themselves surrounded before they knew the Americans had arrived. Towns fell before their garrisons could organize resistance. Supply depots were captured intact. German soldiers who had been told the Americans were soft and poorly led discovered that neither description was accurate. The division was commanded by Major General John Shirley Wood, a man his soldiers called Tiger Jack. Wood was aggressive, unconventional, and beloved by his troops. He had been a professor of French at West Point before the war, which earned him the nickname P for Professor among his fellow officers. But his men knew him by a different name. They called him Tiger Jack because of his ferocity in combat and his insistence on offensive action at every opportunity. Wood believed in speed. He believed that a moving tank was harder to hit than a stationary one. He believed that an enemy kept off balance could not coordinate effective resistance. He believed in striking before the enemy could react, in leading from the front rather than commanding from the rear. British military historian Basil Liddell Hart would later call Wood the Rommel of the American armored forces. Like the famous German field marshal, Wood commanded from forward positions, often placing himself at the point of greatest danger. Like Rommel, he understood that armored warfare rewarded boldness and punished hesitation, and like Rommel, he trained his division to operate with a speed and independence that horrified more cautious commanders. But by mid-September, the lightning advance had ground to a halt. Not because of German resistance, not because the division had outrun its combat power, because of gasoline. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, had diverted fuel supplies to support Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. Patton's Third Army was stranded in eastern France with nearly empty tanks and a frustrated commander who spent days pleading for fuel that never arrived. This pause gave the Germans exactly what they needed: time. Adolf Hitler ordered an immediate counteroffensive. The objective was to destroy the American bridgehead over the Moselle River and push Patton's forces back into central France. If successful, the attack would buy time for Germany to consolidate its defences along the Siegfried Line and prepare for the coming winter. Hitler believed that a sharp defeat might convince the Americans to negotiate rather than continue their costly advance. To accomplish this, the German Fifth Panzer Army assembled 262 tanks and assault guns. The force included over 100 of the formidable Panther tanks, the finest medium armour Germany produced. It also included Panzer IV tanks, assault guns, and armoured personnel carriers. The force was divided into two new panzer brigades, the 111th and the 113th, plus elements of the veteran 11th Panzer Division. On paper, it was a formidable force. The commanders who planned the offensive expected a quick victory. They would strike the American spearhead with overwhelming armoured power, destroy the 4th Armoured Division, and roll up the 3rd Army's flank before Patton could react. The reality was far different. The German panzer brigades were not elite formations. They were improvised units cobbled together in desperate haste to meet Hitler's timetable. The corps personnel came from survivors of destroyed divisions on the Eastern Front, men who had been through the meat grinder of the Soviet summer offensive and emerged with shattered nerves and broken units. These veterans were experienced, yes, but they were also exhausted, demoralized, and scattered across Germany waiting for new assignments. To fill out the brigades, the German army pulled Luftwaffe ground personnel who had never crewed a tank, naval personnel from ships that would never sail again, and young conscripts with minimal training. Most of the tank crews had received only 2 weeks of instruction before being sent into combat. 2 weeks to learn to drive a 45-ton vehicle. 2 weeks to learn to load, aim, and fire a high-velocity cannon. 2 weeks to learn to work as a 5-man team in a steel box where a single mistake meant fiery death. Many could not read maps. Some had never fired their main guns in live exercises because fuel shortages prevented adequate training. Others had never driven their tanks at night or in fog. They knew the theory of armoured warfare from manuals and lectures. They knew nothing of its reality. These crews were given brand new Panther tanks, machines that required experienced maintenance and careful handling, and told to destroy Patton's spearhead. The Panther was a magnificent machine, but it was also a demanding one. Its transmission was notoriously fragile, requiring careful handling that inexperienced drivers rarely provided. Its front final drives, made of lower quality steel as Germany's raw material situation deteriorated, wore out quickly when subjected to rough treatment. Experienced crews knew how to baby these components, how to avoid the jerky starts and abrupt stops that damaged them. Inexperienced crews did not. German maintenance records from the campaign tell a story of mechanical failures almost as devastating as combat losses. Panthers broke down on approach marches before reaching the battle. Transmissions failed during maneuvers. Engines overheated because crews did not know the proper warm-up procedures. Of the tanks lost during the Arracourt fighting, nearly as many were abandoned due to mechanical problems as were destroyed by enemy fire. The experienced German panzer crews who had fought from Poland to France to Russia knew how to keep their machines running. They knew the sounds that indicated trouble, the vibrations that warned of impending failure, the subtle signs that something was wrong. But those experienced crews were dead, captured or scattered across Europe in shattered units. The men climbing into these Panthers had no such knowledge. They had been told they were riding the finest tanks in the world. What they were not told was that those tanks required the finest crews in the world to realize their potential. Opposing them was Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division, commanded by Colonel Bruce Clark. Clark was an engineer by training who had graduated from West Point in 1925 and earned a degree from Cornell. He was a problem solver, a student of mobile warfare, and one of the most capable tactical commanders in the American Army. Clark's command consisted primarily of the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, plus the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, elements of the 35th Tank Battalion, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion equipped with M18 Hellcats, and supporting artillery from multiple field artillery battalions. Clark had roughly 45 tanks to oppose the German attack. The Germans were bringing 130, but Clark had something the Germans did not. His men had been fighting together since Normandy. They had learned each other's habits, trusted each other's judgment, knew how to coordinate without extensive radio communication. More importantly, they had spent 2 years training under Tiger Jack Wood before entering combat. 2 years, 730 days of maneuvers, exercises, simulations, and critiques. 730 days of learning to work as teams. 730 days of building the kind of trust that allowed tank commanders to know what their wingmen would do without asking. The training had not been easy. Wood pushed his men hard, demanding standards that some officers thought excessive. Crews conducted live fire exercises in conditions that simulated combat as closely as possible. They trained at night, in bad weather, over unfamiliar terrain. They made mistakes and learned from them. They failed and tried again. But more than technical skills, Wood trained his men to think. He wanted tank commanders who could assess a situation and act without waiting for orders. He wanted gunners who could engage targets without being told. He wanted drivers who understood tactical movement, not just how to steer a tank. He wanted crews who functioned as teams, each man knowing his job and trusting his crewmates to know theirs. This philosophy extended throughout the division. Officers at every level are expected to take initiative, to exploit opportunities without waiting for approval from above. Radio communications were used to coordinate, not to control. Commanders trusted their subordinates to make good decisions because they had trained with those subordinates for 2 years and knew their capabilities. The German army had once operated the same way. The concept of mission-type tactics, called Auftragstaktik, was a German invention that had made their early war victories possible. But by 1944, the German army had lost most of the officers who understood and practiced this approach. The men leading the panzer brigades at Arracourt were strangers to each other, operating under centralized command structures that required approval for actions their American counterparts executed automatically. The German crews had received 14 days. That difference would prove decisive. The first indication that something unusual was happening came on September 14th, 5 days before the main battle began. The 37th Tank Battalion had pushed east across the Moselle River and driven deep into German-held territory. Near the village of Valhy, they encountered German forces from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, a veteran unit that had been fighting since North Africa. Sergeant Joseph Sadowski was commanding the 2nd Tank in the lead column as Company A entered the village square. Sadowski was 26 years old, born in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, to a Polish immigrant family. He had enlisted in the army in May of 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, and had been with the 37th Tank Battalion since its formation. By September of 1944, he was one of the most experienced tank commanders in the division. As Sadowski's Sherman rounded a corner into the square, a German 88mm anti-tank gun fired from less than 20 yards away. The round struck the tank squarely, penetrating the armor, and igniting the ammunition stored inside. The Sherman burst into flames. The suddenness of the attack froze the column. Tank crews in the following vehicles did not know where the fire was coming from. German infantry opened up from windows and doorways with machine pistols and rifles. The situation was chaos. Sadowski did not hesitate. He ordered his crew to dismount and take cover in the buildings lining the square. As his men scrambled clear of the burning tank, Sadowski realized that one member of his crew, the bow gunner, had been unable to escape. The man was trapped inside the burning vehicle, and the flames were spreading. Without hesitation, Sadowski ran back through the hail of German fire and climbed onto the hull of his burning Sherman. He tried to pry open the bow gunner's hatch, working with his bare hands against metal that was already heating from the flames inside. German machine gunners concentrated their fire on him. Rifle rounds cracked past his head. Still he worked, trying to free his trapped crewmate. Sadowski was killed by a burst of machine gun fire before he could complete his rescue. He fell across the hull of his tank, hands still reaching for the hatch. Sadowski's death could have paralyzed the American advance. Instead, it galvanized it. The remaining tank crews, inspired by their sergeant's sacrifice, pressed forward with increased ferocity. They destroyed 8 German 88mm anti-tank guns and killed or captured 300 enemy soldiers. The town of Valhay fell within the hour. Sadowski would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, the citation noting that his gallant and noble sacrifice of his life in the aid of his comrade, undertaken in the face of almost certain death, so inspired the remainder of the tank crews that they pressed forward with greater determination. But what mattered that afternoon was what his death revealed about American tank crews. These were not conscripts fighting because they had no choice. These were not men who had been assigned to tanks because there was nowhere else to put them. These were volunteers who believed in each other so deeply that they would die rather than abandon a comrade. That kind of unit cohesion cannot be manufactured in 2 weeks of training. It cannot be ordered into existence by commanders or mandated by regulations. It grows from shared experience, shared hardship, shared danger. It grows from men who have fought together, bled together, lost friends together. The German tank crews arriving in Lorraine had none of this. Many had met their fellow crewmen only days before entering combat. Their commanders were strangers. Their tactics were untested. They had superior machines, but they did not have the invisible bonds that transform 5 men in a steel box into a fighting team. On the morning of September 19th, the German offensive began in earnest. The 113th Panzer Brigade struck first, advancing through fog toward the American positions around Arracourt. The brigade commander, Colonel Erich von Seckendorf, ordered his Panthers forward in company formations, confident that his superior armor would sweep aside whatever opposition the Americans could muster. The fog was so thick that visibility dropped to less than 75 meters in some areas. German commanders considered this an advantage. It would protect their tanks from American aircraft, which had been devastating German formations whenever the weather cleared. It would allow them to close to effective range before the Americans could bring their longer-range weapons to bear. What the German commanders did not consider was what that fog would do to their own coordination. The 113th Panzer Brigade had virtually no reconnaissance units. The haste of its formation had not allowed for proper organization of scouts and forward observers. The brigade advanced blind, its Panthers feeling their way forward through the murk with no clear picture of what lay ahead. This was a fundamental failure of German planning. Reconnaissance had always been a German strength. Their pre-war panzer divisions had included specialized reconnaissance battalions that scouted ahead of the main force, identified enemy positions, and provided crucial intelligence. But the panzer brigades had been assembled too quickly to include such units. They were all fangs and no eyes. The American forces, by contrast, had excellent reconnaissance. The 25th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron provided continuous information about German movements. Artillery spotter aircraft, when weather permitted, observed enemy formations from above. Infantry patrols probed German positions and reported what they found. Colonel Clark knew where the Germans were. The German commanders did not know where he was. This asymmetry of information proved decisive. The Americans could prepare positions, coordinate supporting fires, and position reserves to meet attacks they knew were coming. The Germans stumbled forward into ambushes they never saw coming, engaged enemies whose positions they never identified, lost tanks to fire from directions they never expected. Captain William Dwight was the 37th Battalion's liaison officer to Combat Commander Headquarters. Shortly after 7 that morning, he was returning from a routine coordination meeting when he spotted movement in the fog. Panthers, German Panthers, and they were heading directly toward Colonel Clark's command post. Dwight did not wait for orders. He grabbed a platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers and a handful of Sherman crews and organized an immediate defense of the road leading to headquarters. The M18 Hellcat was an unusual vehicle. It mounted a 76mm gun that could penetrate Panther side armor at close range, but it carried almost no armor of its own. The Hellcat's protection was its speed. It was the fastest tracked vehicle in the American inventory, capable of 55 miles per hour on roads. Its crews called it the fastest thing on tracks. In the fog, speed meant nothing. Every engagement would be at close range, where the Hellcat's thin armor made it terribly vulnerable. A single hit from a Panther's gun would destroy it. But Dwight had no other options. The Panthers were coming, and someone had to stop them. What followed was a desperate running battle through the French countryside. Dwight's tank destroyers engaged the Panthers at distances sometimes measured in dozens of yards rather than hundreds. At such ranges, the Panthers' superior gun and armor meant nothing. The M18 crews used their speed to dodge between hedgerows and farm buildings, snapping off shots at exposed flanks before disappearing into the fog. 9 Panthers burned that morning near the command post. Dwight lost 3 of his 4 Hellcats, their thin armor no match for the German guns when the Panthers managed to get clear shots. But he held them. He held them long enough for reinforcements to arrive, long enough for Clark to organize a coherent defense, long enough for the German attack to lose its momentum. Dwight survived the battle. He would later receive the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that morning, the citation noting that his rapid and heroic action was largely responsible for preventing the enemy from overrunning the command post. While Dwight fought his delaying action near headquarters, the main German assault was developing against Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion near the village of Leasy. Lamerson had positioned 2 of his Shermans in a concealed position overlooking the Basange Road, their hulls dug into the reverse slope of a small ridge so that only their turrets were visible. The position had been prepared during the night by crews who understood that their survival depended on using terrain to compensate for their tank's inferior armor. The tank commanders in. Those forward positions had been watching the fog since before dawn, listening to the distant rumble of engines and waiting for targets to appear. When the Panthers finally emerged from the mist, they were less than 75 meters away. At that range, even the Sherman's standard 75mm cannon could penetrate Panther armor. Not the front, which was too thick and too well sloped. But the sides and rear were vulnerable, especially at close quarters where the American rounds could strike at favorable angles. The lead Panther never saw what killed it. An American gunner put a round into the turret ring, where the rotating turret met the hull. The Panther lurched to a stop and began to burn. A second Panther tried to reverse but exposed its thinner rear armor in the process. The Sherman crew destroyed it before the German driver could complete his turn. The German column had walked directly into an ambush. Their inexperienced crews had no idea where the fire was coming from. The fog concealed the American positions, and the smoke from burning tanks added to the confusion. Some Panther commanders tried to advance, looking for targets. Others tried to retreat. Some sat motionless, their crews paralyzed by the sudden violence. The result was chaos. Lamerson coordinated his platoons by radio, directing tanks to positions where they could engage the confused Germans from multiple directions. American crews who had trained together for 2 years executed fire and maneuver drills without conscious thought, each tank commander knowing where his wingmen would be and what they would do. The German crews, fighting together for the first time, had no such coordination. When their radios crackled with orders, they often could not identify who was speaking or what unit was being addressed. When Panthers moved to support each other, they sometimes drove into the fire of other Panthers who mistook them for American tanks in the fog. By the time the fog began to lift, around noon, 43 German tanks lay burning across the battlefield. American losses that first day were 8 tanks, 5 Shermans, and 3 tank destroyers. The disparity in losses was staggering. The Germans had committed their best armor, outnumbered the defenders by nearly 3-1, and achieved tactical surprise in the fog. By every conventional measure, they should have won. Instead, they had been destroyed. The survivors retreated in disarray. German officers who tried to rally their crews found men who had lost all confidence in their training, their commanders, and their equipment. Panthers that had seemed invincible in training films now burned like any other tank when hit from the flank. Crews that had been told they would sweep aside American opposition had instead been ambushed, outmaneuvered, and decimated. That night, German commanders held urgent conferences to determine what had gone wrong. They blamed the fog, which had prevented them from using their tanks' superior range. They blamed the terrain, which channeled their formations into predictable avenues of approach. They blamed inadequate reconnaissance, which had allowed them to drive directly into prepared American positions. What they did not blame was the fundamental assumption underlying their entire plan. They had assumed that tank quality would determine the outcome. They had assumed that a Panther was worth 2 or 3 Shermans, that the math would work in their favor regardless of other factors. They had assumed that American crews would fight as German crews fought, tank against tank in stand-up duels where superior armor and firepower would decide. None of these assumptions proved correct. The German commanders could not understand what had happened. Their Panthers had superior firepower and armor. Their formations outnumbered the Americans nearly 3-1, yet they had been massacred. The answer lay in something German intelligence had completely failed to consider. The Americans were not fighting tank against tank in stand-up duels where superior armor would decide the outcome. They were fighting as combined arms teams, coordinating multiple types of units to create effects that no single unit could achieve alone. Infantry spotted for armor, reporting German positions by radio and guiding tanks to advantageous firing positions. Artillery provided suppressive fire, forcing German crews to button up inside their tanks where their vision was severely restricted. Tank destroyers moved to flanking positions while Shermans engaged frontally, creating deadly crossfires that left German tanks with no safe direction to turn. And when the weather cleared even briefly, aircraft from the 19th Tactical Air Command vectored onto German reinforcements, attacking supply columns and reserve formations before they could reach the battle. This was combined arms warfare as the American army had developed it over 2 years of training and 2 months of combat. This was the doctrine that Tiger Jack Wood had drilled into the 4th Armored Division at Pine Camp and Fort Knox and in the deserts of California. The Germans had expected to find their enemy and destroy him with overwhelming firepower. Instead, they found themselves attacked from multiple directions by enemies they could not see, coordinated by a command structure that operated faster than their own. Around noon on September 20th, when the fog finally lifted after 2 days of fighting, something extraordinary happened. Major Charles Carpenter was an artillery spotter pilot assigned to the 4th Armored Division. His job was to fly a small L-4 Grasshopper observation aircraft over the battlefield, locate enemy positions, and call in artillery fire missions. It was important work, but not particularly glamorous. Spotter pilots were not fighter aces. They did not engage the enemy directly. They watched and reported. Carpenter found this frustrating. He had enlisted in the army in 1942, trained as a pilot, and shipped out to France expecting to contribute to the fighting. Instead, he spent his days circling at 1,500 feet, watching battles unfold below him, unable to do anything but call for help that sometimes arrived too late. So Carpenter modified his aircraft. The L-4 Grasshopper was based on the civilian Piper Cub, a simple fabric-covered aircraft with a 65-horsepower engine. It was slow, fragile, and completely unarmed. It had no protection against ground fire and no capacity for offensive weapons. Carpenter gave it both. Working with his ground crew, Carpenter mounted 6 M9 bazookas on the wing struts of his Grasshopper, 3 on each side. The bazookas were infantry anti-tank weapons, tube-launched rockets that could penetrate nearly 4 inches of armor at close range. They were not designed for air-to-ground use. No one had ever tried mounting them on an aircraft. Carpenter tried it anyway. The modifications added significant weight to his aircraft and affected its handling characteristics. The bazookas could only be fired one at a time, using electrical switches that Carpenter had rigged in the cockpit. The rockets were not very accurate, designed for infantry use at close range rather than air-to-ground attacks. None of that mattered to Carpenter. When he spotted a company of Panthers advancing toward Arracourt on the morning of September 20th, he did not call for artillery. He dove his tiny fabric-covered aircraft directly at the German tanks and fired his bazookas. The Grasshopper was never designed for this. It was slow, barely 90 miles per hour in level flight. It had no armor to protect its engine or its pilot. German ground fire filled the air around Carpenter's plane as he made his attack runs. Machine gun tracers reached up toward him. Rifle rounds punched through his fabric wings. Carpenter ignored all of it. He made repeated passes at the German formation, diving to within 100 meters of the ground before releasing his rockets and pulling up. The bazooka round struck from above, where the Panther's armor was thinnest. Even a near miss could damage tracks or running gear, immobilizing a tank and taking it out of the fight. Carpenter fired all 6 of his rockets, returned to base to reload, and flew 2 more sorties that afternoon. In total, he fired 16 rounds at the German formation. He was credited with destroying 2 Panthers and several armored cars. More importantly, his attacks forced the German tank company to retreat, giving a trapped American support unit time to escape. When Carpenter landed after his 3rd sortie, his Grasshopper had multiple bullet holes in its wings and fuselage. The fabric was torn in several places. One strut had been nicked by a round that came within inches of severing it completely. Carpenter named his aircraft Rosie the Rocketer, a play on Rosie the Riveter, the symbol of American women working in war factories. Word of Carpenter's attacks spread through both armies. American troops began calling him Bazooka Charlie. German troops began shooting at every small observation aircraft they saw, no longer assuming that Cubs were harmless. After destroying his 5th tank, Carpenter told a Stars and Stripes correspondent that the word must be getting around to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now, they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother Cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit. The psychological impact of Carpenter's attacks extended far beyond the tanks he destroyed. The Germans had assumed that American observation aircraft were simply scouts, harmless nuisances to be ignored while dealing with real threats. Now every small plane might be a tank killer. Every drone of an engine overhead might be the prelude to a diving attack. The Americans had improvised. They had taken a harmless observation plane and turned it into a weapon. What else? Had they improvised? What else might they be capable of? Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion from his own Sherman, which he had named Thunderbolt. He would go through 7 tanks named Thunderbolt during the war, each one replacing a predecessor that had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The name stayed the same, the paint job stayed the same, a large white Thunderbolt on the turret, visible for hundreds of yards. Some officers would have considered that paint job suicide. It made Abrams' tank an obvious target for every German gunner who could see it. But Abrams did not care about being a target. He cared about being seen by his own men, about leading from the front where everyone could follow him. Abrams was stocky, intense, and absolutely fearless. He had graduated from West Point in 1936 and spent the pre-war years in cavalry units that were transitioning from horses to tanks. He had volunteered for armor duty and had commanded the 37th Tank Battalion since July of 1942, more than 2 years of training his men, learning their capabilities, building the kind of trust that allowed him to lead from the turret of a tank rather than from a command post miles behind the lines. His men revered him. Not because he was easy on them. Abrams was demanding, insistent on high standards, unforgiving of sloppiness or laziness. In Abrams's outfit, nobody drifted, one of his sergeants would later recall. They revered him because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. When the fighting was heaviest, Abrams' Thunderbolt was in the middle of it. When the situation was most dangerous, Abrams was there, his voice crackling over the radio, his tank leading the charge. On September 20th, Abrams personally led a tank assault against German forces that had outflanked 2 of his companies. The situation was critical. German Panthers had penetrated the American lines and were threatening to roll up the battalion from the flank. Abrams did not wait for orders. He did not coordinate a careful response or request reinforcements. He gathered what tanks he could find and attacked immediately. His driver recalled the assault years later. Abrams was in the turret, firing the main gun himself when the gunner could not acquire targets fast enough. The tank was moving at full speed across open ground, rounds cracking past, dirt geysering up from near misses. Abrams was yelling commands, firing, directing other tanks by radio all at once. They drove directly into the German formation. At close range, where crew training mattered more than armor thickness, the Shermans were equal to the Panthers. Abrams' tank destroyed multiple German vehicles. More importantly, his ferocity threw the German attack into confusion and allowed his disorganized companies to regroup. For this action, Abrams received the Distinguished Service Cross, the citation noting that he quickly and accurately estimated the situation and unhesitatingly attacked the enemy force with his command tank, striking with such ferocity that the enemy was thrown into a state of confusion. The German commanders could not understand American tactics. They had expected the Americans to fight defensively, using their inferior tanks from hull-down positions and relying on air support and artillery to compensate for their weakness in armor. That was what doctrines said inferior forces should do. That was what sensible commanders would do. No one told Creighton Abrams to be sensible. The fighting continued for 11 days. Each morning, German commanders threw fresh attacks at the American positions. Each day, the attacks failed. On September 22nd, the battered remnants of the 111th Panzer Brigade, which had been mauled fighting at Luneville since September 18th, launched a desperate assault near Juvilliers, with only 7 operational tanks remaining. Combined with the shattered 113th and elements of the veteran 11th Panzer Division, the Germans attempted their largest coordinated assault yet. General Hasso von Manteuffel commanded the German 5th Panzer Army. He was an experienced armoured commander who had fought in Poland, France, Russia, and North Africa. He understood mobile warfare and had won victories against superior forces before. He was determined to crack the American position at Arracourt. The assault achieved nothing. American artillery, now fully coordinated with forward observers and aerial spotters, broke up German formations before they could reach assault distance. American fighters from the 19th Tactical Air Command, finally able to operate now that the weather had cleared, attacked German supply columns and reinforcements. American tank crews, now fully confident in their tactics and their ability to beat Panthers at close range, destroyed German armor with increasing efficiency. By September 25th, the German 5th Panzer Army had only 25 operational tanks remaining out of the 262 it had committed to the offensive. 237 had been destroyed, damaged, or broken down. Many had been abandoned by their crews when minor mechanical problems left them stranded, problems that experienced crews might have repaired, but inexperienced crews could not diagnose. The counter-offensive was over. What had begun as Hitler's plan to throw Patton back across central France had ended as one of the most lopsided American armoured victories of the war. The 5th Panzer Army, which had been assembled at great cost to strike a decisive blow, had been reduced to a shell. The panzer brigades that were supposed to demonstrate the continuing potency of German armour had instead demonstrated its limitations when crewed by inadequately trained men. The statistical summary told the story. Of the 262 tanks and assault guns that the Germans committed to the battle, 86 were confirmed destroyed by enemy fire. 114 were damaged or broken down, many abandoned by crews who lacked the skills or tools to repair them. Only 62 remained operational when the shooting stopped. The American 4th Armored Division lost 41 medium tanks and 7 light tanks during the entire month of September, with total casualties of 225 killed and 648 wounded. These numbers would be analyzed by military historians for decades. They showed that superior training and doctrine could overcome technological disadvantage. They showed that crew quality mattered more than vehicle quality. They showed that the American approach to armored warfare, emphasizing combined arms cooperation and small unit initiative, could defeat the German approach, which relied on concentrated armor and centralized command. But the numbers did not capture what the battle meant to the men who fought it. Colonel Bruce Clark ordered a tactical withdrawal to more defensible positions, but before withdrawing he executed a masterpiece of deception. He staged a fake battle over the radio, complete with orders for a blazing forward attack, explicit coordinates, and unit designations. Clark knew that German intelligence monitored American radio traffic. He gave them exactly what they expected to hear. While the Germans prepared to meet an assault that would never come, Clark's forces quietly repositioned to new defensive lines. By the time the Germans realized they had been fooled, Combat Command A was dug in and waiting. The Germans pressed their attacks for 3 more days, throwing their remaining armor against the American lines in increasingly desperate attempts to salvage something from the disaster. On September 29th, elements of both Panzer brigades and the 110th Panzer Grenadier Regiment made a coordinated assault on American positions near Hill 318. The fog returned that morning, and the Germans hoped it would give them the same advantage it had provided on the first day of the offensive. Instead, the American crews had adapted. They knew the terrain now, knew the approaches, knew exactly where German tanks would have to come. They were waiting. The Germans gained a few hundred yards of ground at terrible cost. By the time the attack faltered in the early afternoon, they had lost the last of their combat power. The 5th Panzer Army existed only on paper. The German after-action reports blamed the weather, blamed the terrain, blamed the lack of air support, blamed the fuel shortages that had hampered training. They did not blame the fundamental flaw in their approach. The Panzer brigades had been designed as shock formations, masses of armor that would overwhelm enemy defenses through firepower and numbers. This doctrine had worked on the Eastern Front, where Soviet units often fought with poor coordination and rigid tactics that made them predictable. German tank crews learned to exploit Soviet weaknesses, learned timing and positioning that let them destroy T-34s with regularity. But the Americans did not fight like the Soviets. American tank crews had been trained to think independently, to adapt to circumstances without waiting for orders, to coordinate with infantry and artillery and aircraft without detailed instructions from above. When German formations attacked expecting to find static defenses, they encountered enemies who moved, who flanked, who seemed to anticipate their movements. This was not magic. It was not superior technology or numerical advantage. It was the result of training. The American crews had spent 2 years learning to fight as teams. The German crews had been given 2 weeks. Corporal John Gatuski served as a gunner in the 37th Tank Battalion throughout the war, crewing Lieutenant Colonel Abrams's own tank Thunderbolt. No one knew exactly how many German tanks he destroyed, but everyone agreed it was more than any other gunner in the unit. His tank commander said Gatuski could put a round through a doorknob at 500 yards while the tank was moving. Gatuski had been with the 37th since its formation at Pine Camp, New York, in April of 1941. He knew his gun the way a craftsman knows his tools, could sense when the elevation was off by a fraction, could compensate for wind and movement without conscious calculation. More importantly, he knew his crew. He knew how his driver would react to orders, knew the loader's rhythm, knew his commander's voice well enough to begin traversing the turret before the command was complete. They had been together so long that they no longer needed words for most situations. The German gunners facing Gatuski had been Luftwaffe ground personnel 3 months earlier. They had been trained on the Panthers' excellent optical sights, had been taught the ballistics of the high-velocity 75mm gun, had practiced in simulators and firing ranges. They knew the theory. They did not know each other. When a target appeared, the German gunner had to wait for orders from his commander, a stranger. He had to trust that his loader, another stranger, would have the correct round ready. He had to hope that his driver, whom he had met only days before, would position the tank correctly. Gatuski's crew operated as a single organism. They had been doing this together for over 2 years. The Germans had superior optics and superior guns and superior armor, but they did not have Gatuski. They did not have crews who had fought together across France. They did not have the invisible advantage of teamwork. The battle would be studied at military academies around the world for decades afterward. It became a textbook example of how a well-trained force with inferior equipment can defeat a poorly trained force with superior equipment. It demonstrated the importance of combined arms coordination, of unit cohesion, of leaders who trusted their subordinates, and subordinates who trusted their leaders. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams would go on to command all American forces in Vietnam during the most difficult years of that war. He would serve as Army Chief of Staff, the highest uniformed position in the United States Army. When the Army developed a new main battle tank in the 1970s, they named it the M1 Abrams in his honor. Today, the Abrams tank remains the backbone of American armored forces. Colonel Bruce Clark would become a 4-star general and command United States Army Europe during the Cold War. General Eisenhower would later say that Clark was one of the finest tactical commanders America produced during the Second World War. Clark's defense at Arracourt and his subsequent actions at St. Vith during the Battle of the Bulge became models for how to conduct mobile defense against superior forces. Major Charles Carpenter, Bazooka Charlie, was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease shortly after the war ended. Doctors gave him 2 years to live. He returned to Illinois and resumed his job as a high school history teacher, the profession he had practiced before the war. He lived for another 2 decades, defying the diagnosis that should have killed him. When asked about his combat exploits, he said his idea of fighting a war was to attack, and then attack again. He died in 1966 at the age of 53. The 4th Armored Division continued to serve as Patton's spearhead through the end of the war. In December of 1944, when the Germans launched their last great offensive in the Ardennes, the division raced 150 miles in 19 hours to relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. Lieutenant Charles Bogues of Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, commanding a Sherman nicknamed Cobra King, was the first American tank to break through the German encirclement on December 26, 1944. The relief of Bastogne became one of the most celebrated American actions of the war. The men who fought at Arracourt did not think of themselves as exceptional. They were farm boys and factory workers, school teachers and mechanics. They came from small towns across America, places like Perth-Amboy, New Jersey, where Sergeant Sadowski grew up, and Urbana, Illinois, where Bazooka Charlie Carpenter had taught high school history. They did not have the best equipment. The Sherman was inferior to the Panther by almost every technical measure. They did not have numerical superiority. They were outnumbered nearly 3-1 when the battle began. What they had was each other. They had trained together, fought together, bled together. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, trusted each other's judgment, believed in each other's courage. When everything went wrong, when the fog hid their enemies and the odds seemed impossible, they had that trust to fall back on. That was enough. In 1999, the citizens of Valhay, France, erected a monument honoring Sergeant Joseph Sadowski, the tank commander who had died trying to save his trapped crewmate 55 years earlier. A decade later, Colonel James Leach, who had commanded Company B of the 37th Tank Battalion and had known Sadowski personally, travelled to France for the 65th anniversary of the Lorraine liberation. Leach was 87 years old by then, one of the last surviving officers from Arracourt. Standing before the monument, he spoke about the young sergeant who had climbed onto a burning tank under enemy fire to try to save a friend. He did not talk about tactics or doctrine or equipment specifications. He talked about courage and sacrifice and the bonds between men who fight together. He talked about what it meant to serve beside men like Sadowski, men who would give everything for their comrades. That is, the lesson of Arracourt. Not that American tanks were better than German tanks, they were not. Not that American crews were braver than German crews. Bravery was abundant on both sides. Not that American commanders were smarter than German commanders. Both sides had capable leaders. The lesson is that teams matter more than tools. Training matters more than technology. Trust matters more than tonnage. The American tankers at Arracourt proved that a crew who knows and trusts each other can accomplish things that seem impossible on paper. They proved that years of shared training create bonds that cannot be replicated in weeks. They proved that leadership from the front inspires men to achievements beyond what anyone expects of them. Every American tank commander at Arracourt faced the same reality. His Sherman could not penetrate a Panther's front armor at any range. If he fought the way the Germans expected him to fight, he would lose, so he did not fight that way. He used terrain to get flank shots. He used speed to close range before the Panther could react. He used teamwork to create crossfires that left the enemy with no safe direction to turn. He improvised, he adapted, he overcame. That is what Americans do. The Germans sent their finest tanks into battle crewed by strangers. The Americans sent their farm boys into battle as brothers. The brothers won. The 37th Tank Battalion still exists today, now designated the 37th Armor Regiment. Its motto remains "Courage Conquers," the same words that Abrams painted on his thunderbolts. The regiment's headquarters displays photographs from Arracourt, from Bastogne, from the Long March across Europe. Young soldiers study those photographs and learn the names of men who fought in Sherman's 8 decades ago. They learn about Abrams and Clark and Sadowski. They lee